All right, our next speaker is Kathleen Smith, who's going to talk about, jumping the gun, give us an overview of the wildlife surveys and habitat management conducted on Crew, wildlife and environmental area.
Okay, so some of you know me. I'm Kathleen Smith. I work for Florida Fish and Wildlife at Crew, which I'll talk a little bit about the map of Crew here. We are in the yellow. We're depicted in the yellow. We have 3 different areas. First, Corkscrew Marsh and Cypress Stones, which is near Corkscrew Road. So this is Corkscrew Road here. This dotted dashed line is I-75. Flint Pan Strand is our other portion of Crew, and then Corkscrew Swamp is our last portion of Crew. And this is Immokalee Road here. So as you can see, we're located between Immokalee Road and Corkscrew Road, and Corkscrew Swamp is in the center of the watershed. Crew is about 30,000 acres of the 60,000 acre watershed. I'll talk to you a little bit about our management structure because it tends to be a little bit confusing to people because there's several entities involved in Crew. So first I'll start off with the Crew landowners. That's the South Florida Water Management District. Joe Baza is the land manager. Mako Touche and James Mizell are the technicians for the district. The district contracts with 2 different cooperators. The first cooperator, Florida Fish and Wildlife, who I work for. We mainly do the wildlife surveys and hunting management on Crew, but we also participate in other activities like prescribed fire. There are 2 staff members, myself and Tiffany Thornhill, who are the members of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Crew. The second cooperator being the Crew Land and Water Trust. They mainly do environmental education, and they also do land acquisition at Crew. And they have 2 staff members as well, Brenda Brooks, who's the executive director, and Jessie Drummond. She's the environmental education specialist. But I don't want to not mention the enormous staff of volunteers as well that also help run Crew. Here's a list of the projects ongoing at Crew, and it's just a brief list, not all-encompassing. The projects that are listed in black are the ones that are currently ongoing. The ones that are listed in blue are upcoming projects, and the one in gray we have been working on, but we're currently not doing right now. It's on hold. The 2 that I'm going to talk about today are the Florida Bonneted Bat Acoustical Survey and the Crew Marsh Herbicide Treatment. First, the Florida Bonneted Bat. As most of you probably know, the Florida Bonneted Bat was state listed here in Florida until October 2013, when it became federally listed. It resides exclusively in South Florida, although recently they found some points on the Kissimmee River, some acoustical calls, and also at Avon Park for the Florida Bonneted Bat. Some of the threats to this species are small population size, restricted extent of occurrence, and also, in terms of habitat, loss of forested habitat and limited roost availability. These specific species actually roost both in artificial roost as well as natural roosts. So that does give them some flexibility, but their natural roosts are also being limited. Pesticide use also might be an issue, specifically in terms of the populations that we see in some of the more urban areas like Coral Gables. So that might also be an issue in terms of limiting their population. So recently, in December 2014, we started a bonneted bat acoustical survey in the Flint Pen area of Crew. And the objective being to determine whether or not we have Florida bonneted bats. So the easiest way to do this would be to place out acoustical detectors on the area. We want to determine, number 1, if they're present, and number 2, how they're using the area. So are they commuting, are they foraging, are they actually roosting on the area? Those are some of the things that we want to find out. So first, that was our first goal. The second goal also too is we're having a Southern Critical Crew hydrologic restoration project that is slated for 2016. And that's one thing that may affect how they're foraging if they are on the area. And this is a secondary part of the project, and one thing that we're going to try and look at if we do find bonneted bats, we're also going to expand the monitoring on the area. This is a map of the hydrologic restoration that's planned to occur in the southern floodplain area. And I'll just orient you here. I-75 is over on this side. This is Bonita Beach Road here. So this area here is slated for hydrologic restoration. And if you guys are familiar with the Picayune Strand hydrologic restoration, which some of you are very familiar with, it's a very similar in idea, but much smaller scope. So they're going to be removing some of the berms and filling some of the ditches to restore the hydrologic of the hydro period and also the sheet flow of the area. So how do you find a bonneted bat? How do you find bats in general? So that's a very difficult question to answer, but probably the easiest way is to use an acoustical detector. This is SM2 bat detector model from Wildlife Acoustics. This is the one that we're going to be using. We have 2 of those. We're placing it near water features. And as you can see, I placed the detector in this box, and it's a waterproof box. And I have a deep cycle marine battery hooked up to it. And then that will allow the detector to run for longer. I don't have to change the batteries as frequently. And so after that, here's the detector that's actually set up. Here's the box that I was showing you earlier. And the microphone is up here, and again, there's a water feature here. As I mentioned, the recording started in December 2014. We have 9 locations in southern Flint Pen. Right now, we're not monitoring northern Flint Pen, primarily because of the hydrologic restoration project is really what we want to try to focus on for right now. We're surveying a variety of habitats. At this point, we're recording for 16 consecutive nights at each location. And the locations are no closer than 0.3 miles apart. We're also not counting nights that go below 55 degrees because typically, particularly with bonneted bats, they are more of a tropical species, so they're not nearly as active during colder temperatures. In terms of the duration of the project, we're doing it for a minimum of 1 year, and we're probably going to do some follow-up surveys once the 1 year is over, and also then after the restoration. So what do we get after we set up the detector and we put the data on the computer? So this is what we're looking at when we pull up some of these files. Obviously, you have to have a specific program that will look at these acoustical recordings. We're using Sonobat. So just to give you a brief rundown of how to analyze bat calls, so I'm going to nerd you out here. So bat calls, basically bat species have a distinct call signature. And several different species will have different call signatures based on their flight patterns, their morphology, whether or not they're, what's changing in their environment. So are they trying to detect prey? Are they just commuting? Different things like that will create different call signatures. And so that's what we're looking at here. And to make it even more difficult, the specific bats have different call repertoires as well. So they will have a lot of variability in the call depending on the species. Tidarida, the worst species to analyze because they have a lot of flexibility in their call signatures. Something like a bonneted bat is actually one of the much easier species to identify because it has such a low characteristic frequency. It's the lowest characteristic frequency that we have here in Florida. So when I pull this up on the screen, this is what I see. I see a Florida bonneted bat. I know that it's that. This is frequency, and this is time here. So I'm looking at frequency over time. And this is a call sequence. What I do is I isolate a specific call or calls to identify that bat. So when I do that, I can choose a specific call on the computer. And what it'll do is isolate that call. So when I isolate that call, it will give me, it's real hard to see probably, but a lot of different components of that call. So it gives me characteristic frequency, which is one of the main components that we use to identify the bat species. It'll also give me high and low frequency, also duration, different characteristics like that. This right here is actually an autoclassifier. So as technology is advancing, people are trying to create auto classifiers that you'll put the bat call into the program, and it'll come out and it'll tell you what the bat is. I will tell you that they're not foolproof. They're way less than foolproof. I don't even typically use them most of the time, to be honest with you. But one thing that you do have to realize is the specific call library that's created using that classifier needs to have your bat species in it in order to correctly identify it. So this is calling it a hoary bat. It's not a hoary bat. We don't get hoary bats down here. But this is a bonneted bat. And so you also have to it's not dummy proof for sure. You have to know what bat species you have and then analyze it from there. So this is just a real quick snapshot of what we do in terms of the analysis. We haven't obviously analyzed the data yet, but we are going to, and hopefully maybe at the next science forum I could present the information about what we found. But this is just a brief synopsis of what we will be doing this year. So I'll move on to our Crew Marsh Habitat Improvement Project. So here was one of our challenges with our Crew Marsh, which is very similar, I think, to some of the challenges that Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary is facing. We have mature, and when I say mature, I'm talking about 20 to 30 foot high willow, salix species in the Crew Marsh. Mike touched on this obviously quite a bit in his presentation. They are native, but they tend to be invasive. And why is that? Well, I guess we're investigating several different factors with that, whether it's hydrology, whether it's presence of fire has not been in there, several different factors, nutrient loads from nearby orange groves, many different factors could be contributing to the fact that we have willow in the marsh. Some of our problems with this, is it reduces the accessibility for us as biologists, land managers into the marsh. If we have 30-foot high willows, there's no way we're going to be able to get through it in the airboat. And it is taking up a huge portion of the marsh. So it's well over 1,000 acres within our marsh. And it also limits the burnable vegetation, which is an issue because, and going back to what Mike was saying earlier, I mean, obviously, South Florida is fire adapted. So in terms of burning the marsh, it's something that we'd like to do, but clearly the willows won't burn. So it's not going to be something that's going to be a burnable portion of the marsh. And the more they get, the less we're going to be able to burn it. And thirdly, it also limits the wading bird foraging. And as most of you know, specifically at Corkscrew, with the wood storks, we are losing a lot of the shallow wetland areas for wading bird foraging. And so this is a problem, and it's something that we'd like to try and open up a little bit more for those foraging wading birds. We had several different objectives to this project. Some are short-term, some are long-term. As I mentioned, we'd like to decrease the undesirable salix coverage in the marsh, and we also want to increase the herbaceous coverage. So our short-term goal would be we want less than 50% salix coverage in the marsh 2 years post-treatment. And I'll go over the treatment in just a minute, but we're doing some aerial herbicide treatment with this particular project here. Long-term, we want to try and compare the treatments. So what we've done, and I'll go through this on the next slide, is do several different treatments, and we want to try to determine long-term whether or not the highest ratio was most effective, maybe the lowest ratio was most effective, what type of species are we getting regenerating in the marsh. And then also, again, going back to the bigger picture, why? Obviously, we're treating a symptom. What is the problem? And that's really what we're trying to get at. But first, we want to try and make it a little bit more manageable for us to get in there, and also, again, to improve habitat for the species while we do that. So the methods of this, as I mentioned, we're doing an aerial herbicide treatment. It's going to be in 2 phases. We did a first treatment in August, September of 2014, and we're going to be doing a second phase of treatment in August, September of 2015. As you can see, the yellow, where the yellow areas are, is what we treated this past August, September. This is, you probably can't read these, but it's 120. This is 120 to 64 ratio, 80 to 24, and 19 to 16. And the herbicides that we were using were aquatic use labels. They were glyphosate and imazapyr, and those are the ratios there. So as I mentioned before, our long-term goal with this project was to try and test these different ratios and see, okay, well, what works the best? And in terms of long-term regeneration, is the 120 to 64 going to prevent willow regeneration more than the 96 to 16? We don't know yet. We're not sure of those answers, but that's one thing that we're testing. With that, again, we had some control areas between the treatments so that we can sort of see the difference between the treatment and the control. In terms of testing this, we are taking georeferenced photos, so rectified georeferenced photos of the area. We did an initial photograph at 2 months, which you're going to see in a minute. We're going to do 6 months and 12 months photographs just to see what comes back. In addition to the photos, obviously we're going to be on the ground truthing and seeing what comes back. So that's what we're going to be trying to do in terms of results. This year, for another project that we're going to try and treat this area, we have not been approved for the project yet, but I'll talk about it in a minute. This is some cattail and primrose that we'd like to try and get rid of. But this portion has not been approved yet, like I said. But what we hope to do there is also look at the seed bank and see what potentially might regenerate, so we know what we're going to get in the future. And I'll talk about native planting in a minute. These are some of the desirable herbaceous species that we want back in the marsh instead of the salix. So we've got pickerel weed, maiden crane, cordgrass, sawgrass, duck potato. We already have some of these species in the marsh, but obviously it's something that we'd like more of. As I mentioned, this is the 2-month post-treatment photograph. It was taken in October of 2014. As you can see, it's a very specific outline of the 120 to 64 area. So that matches up to that one. Looks like the treatment was fairly effective, but again, we're looking at long-term. So how is this treatment long-term? Those are just the initial photographs. This is the 80 to 24 segment here, and 96 to 16 segment here. So as you can see, initially the treatment was very effective. We've been up since aerially. We go once a month, and the treatment's actually looking even much better than this. So it did look like it killed a lot of the willow. Unfortunately, we also know that the willow is so thick that there's probably not a lot of desirable species in there, but there are a couple of segments of nice grass that it did kill in the 120 to 64 polygon. But it's sort of, guess what you get when you do the aerial herbicide treatments. So future direction and questions. In terms of our direction, we're going to continue the photo monitoring in phase 1 of the salix treatment. We're going to do phase 2 in August and September of 2015. And then as I mentioned, we put in another application. When I say application, we're actually getting money from ARES, which is a portion of FWC. And we apply with a proposal, and then usually in April we find out whether or not we got the money for the next fiscal year. So that's what we're waiting to hear, is if we got this money for the treatment. But we're going to try and treat some of the cattail and primrose willow at that north segment of the marsh. And in addition to that, in order to spur the investigation into the surface water levels and the rainfall, some of the input into the marsh, we'd like to try and get a water monitoring station. And we did put that into our proposal. And that water monitoring station will be located in the Crew Marsh. And that information will be, it will be a telemetry station. So that information will go directly to DB Hydro. And then so we're not going to have to mess around with too much data entry and things like that. So that'll be helpful for us, I think, if we end up getting it. But that's at least just a start to trying to figure out what's going on in the marsh in order to treat some of the problems. So some of the questions that we still have left, and some of the other things that we hope are going to be answered by this project, is what role does hydrology play in the vegetative state of the willow? I mean, clearly there's something going on. We know that, but we need to obviously investigate that a little bit further. Again, same thing with fire. What can we do with fire eventually to try and get fire back into the marsh? And also too, will these improvements be sustainable long-term? That's a great question. We don't know the answer to that quite yet. But it's something, again, hopefully we'll determine with our investigations into hydrology and things like that. What is the role of native plantings? A lot of people had asked us when we talked about the project, are you going to try and plant some natives in there? I think we probably will. It just depends what we get from that seed bank survey, and then also in terms of the residual effects of the imazapyr in the soils, how long does that stick around? So we're going to have to look at that, and then hopefully do some native plantings at some point in the marsh. And again, the last portion, learning and sharing results. I mean, I think this is a really important factor because I know that Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary has been doing some of the shredding of the willow. So I think we're hopefully trying to share some of that information. We had them shredding in 2009. It didn't seem to be super effective for us, but hopefully you guys are seeing different results. We had seen the stuff that you shredded on Washout Road, and it looks pretty good so far. So I think in terms of looking at this, it's a long-term picture as opposed to a short-term picture.